Can you believe that someone managed to discover over 3,900 mathematical theorems in just 32 short years of life? This Indian genius is without a doubt the most extraordinary figure in the pantheon of mathematics. Why was he able to come up with so many formulas? According to him, and this sounds absolutely unbelievable, it was because the gods would grant him sudden inspiration while he was sleeping or bathing, almost like something out of a fantasy. Scenes that even a scriptwriter wouldn't dare to invent played out in his life with complete authenticity. He is the god of mathematics in India, the greatest academic anomaly the world has seen in nearly a century. Ramanujan, December 22, 1887. In a Brahmin family in Tamil Nadu, India, Ramanujan was born. As the eldest son, his arrival brought immense joy to his parents. When people hear Brahmin, they probably think Ramanujan had a solid start in life. According to India's caste system, even if his family wasn't extremely wealthy, they shouldn't have had to worry about food and drink. But in reality, Ramanujan's family had long since fallen on hard times. His father was so down on his luck that he worked as a clerk in a sari shop, and his mother, to help make ends meet, would sing hymns at a nearby temple in addition to doing housework. Although both parents worked hard, misfortune seemed to constantly hang over this family. At that time, India was in the midst of a century-long smallpox epidemic. At least 38 million Indians died from smallpox. In Tanjore district, where Ramanujan's family lived, about 4,000 people died in 1898 alone. It could be said that smallpox at that time was like the scythe of death itself. Once you caught it, there was no hope of survival. When Ramanujan was 1 year old, his younger brother, who had just been born 3 months earlier, tragically died of smallpox. Not long after, little Ramanujan himself, at just 18 months old, also contracted smallpox. His parents wept every day. In their eyes, this frail boy could never possibly withstand such a deadly illness. But unexpectedly, a month later, Ramanujan miraculously recovered. The illness was cured, but all their money was gone. His mother had no choice but to take him back to her parents' home in Kumbakonam because his grandfather still had some reputation there as a local judge. However, this aroused the resentment of his uncles. 2 years later, when his grandfather lost his job and had no income, the uncles finally found an excuse to throw the mother and son out. In the years that followed, Ramanujan and his mother were bounced back and forth like a ball between his paternal and maternal grandparents' homes. But in fact, as far as Ramanujan himself was concerned, he didn't like living at his grandfather's house because the school there was very dull. Every day, apart from a bit of religion and literature, the teachers taught nothing else. As this went on, Ramanujan began to skip school, and in the end, his grandfather had no choice but to hire someone. A police officer was hired to supervise him going to and from school every day. Because he was so mischievous, his mother had no choice but to take him and completely leave her parents' home, moving back. They moved to Kumbakonam, where her husband lived, and Ramanujan transferred to the local Kangayan school. Compared to other schools, Kangayan Primary School was quite special. In addition to English, religion, and Tamil, geography and arithmetic classes were added. This was the first time Ramanujan came into contact with mathematics. The moment he encountered math, it was as if a door of wisdom had opened for him. To him, numbers were like friends. He believed that every number had its own story, a hidden secret waiting to be discovered. He had no interest in regular subjects, but could spend hours just to solve a single complex math problem. When he was in 3rd grade, the math teacher was teaching division and told the students about all the numbers. If you divide a number by itself, the answer is always 1. But little Ramanujan immediately raised an objection. What if it's 0? 0 divided by 0 isn't 1, it's 0. The math teacher was shocked at the time, feeling that this child's way of thinking was truly unique. From that moment on, Ramanujan's prodigious qualities gradually began to show. At that time, there were 2 college students staying at his house, and they would discuss things with him. When it came to mathematics, however, the 2 college students gradually found themselves completely unable to keep up with his problem-solving approach. By the age of 11, Ramanujan had already mastered all the mathematics courses taught at the university level. When he was 13, someone gave him a book on advanced trigonometry written by S.L. Loney. This book completely ignited his passion for mathematics. He began to devote all his energy to mathematics. He continuously worked on deriving those complex theorems. This focus on mathematics enabled him to earn certificates of excellence and academic awards at the age of 14. After that, Ramanujan continued to participate in various school-level mathematics competitions for his age group. He won awards in these competitions. He won so many awards his hands were full. He could finish an exam paper in half the competition time, and his solutions always showed masterful use of geometry and infinite series. At 15 that year, someone taught Ramanujan to solve cubic equations. Unexpectedly, after thinking about it all night, he managed to surpass his teacher and figured it out on his own. He then went on to study the solution to quartic equations and even further began researching quintic equations. At that time, he had no idea that in general, algebraic equations of degree 5 or higher have no solutions in radicals, solving everything with radicals, all purely out of his love for mathematics. A year later, at the age of 16, Ramanujan received another book from a friend. It was a library book by J.S. Carl titled A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics. It was a summary of results. This book collected about 5,000 theorems, but a large portion of them were not accompanied by theoretical proofs. As one might expect, Ramanujan once again threw himself into it. He carefully studied the contents of this book, independently researching and exploring the proofs of these theorems. After working on Bernoulli numbers, he then went on to calculate the Euler-Mascheroni constant to 15 decimal places. As an absolute genius in the field of mathematics, Ramanujan was so engrossed in mathematical research that he often forgot to eat or sleep. Although his peers found it hard to understand him, they still admired him greatly. Even his teachers favored him, to the extent that the task of assigning teachers to 1,200 new students was handed directly to him. In 1904, Ramanujan graduated from the town high school with perfect marks. The principal, Krishnaswamy Iyer, personally awarded him the Rao Mathematics Prize. In the principal's view, Ramanujan was by far the best student he had ever taught, and he even said that Ramanujan's achievements could surpass a perfect score. Thanks to the principal's recommendation, Ramanujan received a full scholarship to attend Kumbakonam Government Arts College. At first glance, being admitted to university on a scholarship seemed to promise a smooth academic journey for Ramanujan. However, it was from this point on that his life took a sharp downturn, plunging straight into the depths. After entering Kumbakonam Government Arts College, Ramanujan still devoted all his energy to mathematics. But after all, university is not like high school. Excelling in just one subject would not earn you special favor from the teachers. What's more, at that time, India was a colony, and the main subject in university was not mathematics, but English. A student like Ramanujan, who focused only on mathematics and failed all his other subjects, was bound to have a poor reputation. He was the kind of student who would inevitably drag down the school's average grades, as one can easily imagine. Ramanujan quickly lost his scholarship, and the hefty tuition fees became a heavy burden for his family. But even more problematic were his repeated failures. The constant complaints from the school eventually led to his expulsion. For Ramanujan, who had always excelled academically since childhood, this was a huge blow. He didn't dare tell his parents the bad news. After moving, he ran away from home. In Rajamundry, he lived like a reclusive master, doing nothing when he was unhappy. He devoted himself to studying mathematics, not only focusing on series and sequences, but also exploring the relationships between integrals and series. It wasn't until later that he realized what he had been studying at the time was actually elliptic functions. After spending about a month clearing his mind, he regained his confidence in studying. This time, he chose Pachayappa's college in Madras because this school placed more emphasis on mathematics, making it relatively friendly to students like Ramanujan, who excelled in only one subject. But even so, he still failed twice in a row. The reason was still his lopsided academic performance. Apart from mathematics, he failed English, biology, and Sanskrit. Since he couldn't continue his studies, he had no choice but to work. But without a diploma, he couldn't even find a proper job and could only linger on the edge of hunger for years. But even when he was so hungry that he felt dizzy and his vision blurred, Ramanujan still maintained his passion for mathematics. Whenever he had free time, he would study various mathematical problems. He even mentioned in several job application letters that he needed food to keep his brain functioning so he could continue his research. Seeing her son in such a state, his mother naturally couldn't bear it. So she had a sudden inspiration and came up with a jaw-dropping idea: get him married. You see, in most parts of India, there is a tradition that the bride's family must pay a large dowry to the groom's family. Doesn't this mean that getting married would bring in a sum of money? Although it's not very flattering to say that the family was living off a woman, and families that were a good match for Ramanujan's family couldn't actually afford much of a dowry either, his mother introduced him to a girl named Janaki Ammal. The two were married on July 14, 1909. It's worth mentioning that Janaki Ammal was only 10 years old at the time. After all, that's a national custom. Modern people can't really judge this custom. Afterward, Janaki Ammal continued to live with her parents for another 3 years, and it wasn't until 1912, when she had grown a bit older, that she moved in to join Ramanujan. But even after marriage, Ramanujan's streak of bad luck didn't end. He suddenly developed hydrocele, a condition that, at the time, wasn't considered very serious since it wasn't fatal, but it also wasn't minor. Only surgery to drain the fluid from the scrotum could cure it. However, the cost of surgery was astronomical for a family like Ramanujan's. So Ramanujan endured, bearing the pain and hunger, and continued his research until half a year later, when a doctor agreed to treat him for free. Once he recovered, Ramanujan started looking for work again, but he still kept running into obstacles. With no money to buy paper for calculations, he could only scribble on a slate. Seeing how pitiful he was, a friend let him stay at his house and even introduced him to a few high school students preparing for college entrance exams, so he could tutor them and earn a little money to support his family. It wasn't until 1913, when Ramanujan was 23 years old, that things changed. Thanks to his mathematical genius, he finally found a job as a university researcher. Of course, this was entirely due to the help of his friends. But just a few days after recovering from his hydrocele, the chronically frail and sickly Ramanujan fell ill once again. His condition became critical for a time, and fearing that he might not have long to live and that all his life's research would be lost, he asked his friends for help to send out his work. He entrusted a notebook containing all his life's research to two well-known mathematicians of the time. One was Professor Singaravelu Mudalia from Pachayappa's college, and the other was Edward, a British professor at Madras Christian College. B. Ross? However, these two mathematicians looked down on Ramanujan, an unknown and insignificant figure, and dismissed his research. After his friend hit a wall with the two mathematicians, he couldn't bear to see Ramanujan's dire situation any longer, so he pulled some strings and used his connections and finally managed to get in touch with the founder of the Indian Mathematical Society, V. Ramachandra Iyer. Iyer was someone who could recognize true talent. As soon as he got the notebook, he was immediately astonished. He then took Ramanujan's notebook and showed it to Monsieur Chandrasekhar Rao, another Indian mathematician who was also a member of the society. They examined it together. Chandrasekhar Rao was also amazed by Ramanujan's talent. At first, he couldn't even believe it, that Ramanujan had come up with all this on his own, until he met Ramanujan in person. Regarding this meeting, Rao wrote the following in his memoirs. A short, rough-looking figure walked out, with a worn notebook tucked under his arm. He was strong, unshaved, and not very clean. He was very poor, but he had a pair of shining eyes. Later, Rao and Ramanujan discussed elliptic integrals, hypergeometric sets, and divergent sets, which made Rao completely convinced of Ramanujan's talent. After Ramanujan recovered, Iyer and Rao asked him what kind of job he wanted. Ramanujan had lost his former ambition, and only said that he wanted to be a clerk in the tax bureau to support his family. But Iyer felt that a small tax clerk was a waste of his talent and even stifled his talent. Finally, with Iyer's help, Ramanujan became a researcher at the University of Madras and published some of his academic results in the IMS, the Journal of the Indian Mathematical Society. His first article published in IMS was on infinite nested formulas. But because the problem was too difficult, Ramanujan waited for half a year without receiving any reply. In the end, he provided the magazine with a solution, which was a method for solving infinite nested radical problems. He also wrote a paper on the properties of Bohn's algorithm, including his new property that when n is greater than phi. In 2000, he showed that the denominator of a Bono arithmetic fraction is always divisible by 6, and in 1911 he derived a geodetic method for deriving the Bono arithmetic. However, these papers of Ramanujan were also criticized by the mathematical community at the time. Most orthodox academics could not understand his self-taught and unconventional approach. His derivation process was too simple. Some were even equivalent to just writing an answer under the question without any thought process. This made many people suspect that he was just making up the answer to deceive people.
For example, the editor-in-chief of the IMS journal, M.T. Narayana, has said more than once that Mr. Ramanujan's method is very simple and novel, but his expression lacks clarity and precision, making it difficult for ordinary readers to understand. In other words, ordinary people's thinking is not as fast as that of geniuses. However, Ramanujan did not work as a researcher for long. His father lost his job, and the burden of supporting the family became heavier. So he resigned and took a job at the Madras accountant's office with a monthly salary of 20 rupees. He only worked in this job for a few weeks and then applied for a position under the chief accountant of the Madras Port Trust with a monthly salary of 30 rupees.
Along with his job application letter was a recommendation from the President College's mathematics professor. It was a letter of recommendation from E.W. Middlemast. In the letter, it was written that Ramanujan was a young man with outstanding mathematical ability. With the endorsement of such an influential figure, everything went much more smoothly. 3 weeks after applying, Ramanujan was hired, just as Iyer had predicted. For Ramanujan, working in tax was a complete waste of his talents. He could quickly finish his assigned work, freeing up time to continue his mathematical research. Fortunately, this kind of slacking off from his official duties was actually supported by his boss, Sir Francis Spring, because he couldn't bear to see Ramanujan's talent go to waste. In 1913, he even joined Rao and Middlemast in writing to England. They wrote letters to major mathematicians, hoping to introduce Ramanujan to the world. Micaiah John Muller Hill of University College London became their first choice. He was one of Britain's greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, renowned for his work on spherical vortices and tetrahedra. However, Hill's reply was quite a shock. As someone with a formal academic background, he criticized Ramanujan's papers as being full of flaws. He believed that although Ramanujan was interested in mathematics and had some ability, he lacked the necessary educational background and foundation, and thus could never be accepted by the mathematical community. After this, they helped Ramanujan send recommendation letters to several other prominent mathematicians, including Henry Frederick Baker and Ernest William Hobson, but unsurprisingly, all were rejected. These people didn't even bother to write reasons for their refusals. When academic and class backgrounds are intertwined, everyone assumes that geniuses come from distinguished families. No one believes that a phoenix could rise from a colonial chicken coop. Repeated setbacks pushed Ramanujan to the brink of despair. He couldn't understand why his theories were not recognized by the world until January 1913, when he saw J. H. Hardy's 1910 book, Orders of Infinity. After reading this book, Ramanujan finally mustered up his last bit of courage. A few days later, an inconspicuous package was sent from Madras, India. He was about to cross the ocean to England. Inside was a letter addressed to the famous Cambridge mathematician J. H. At that time, no one knew that Hardy's letter would be enough to shake the entire world of mathematics. At the end of the month, this letter finally appeared on Hardy's desk. The beginning of the letter read, "Dear Sir, I take the liberty of introducing myself to you. I am a clerk in the accounts department of the Port Trust office, 23 years old, with an annual salary of only £20. As a poor man, I have not received a formal education, but I have a slight talent for mathematics, and I hope my theorems can be published. Since I lack experience, I will value any advice you give me very much. Please forgive me for any trouble I may have caused you." Enclosed with the letter were at least 11 pages. Mathematical formulas and theorems were included. But they were not limited to divergent series and prime numbers. These topics, such as infinite patterns, greatly shocked Hardy. You have to understand, these are concepts that have troubled mathematicians for centuries. But as Hardy continued reading, things started to become utterly absurd. For example, in Ramanujan's view, the sum of all positive integers could be considered equal to -1/12. These formulas, each presenting only the result without any derivation, seemed like April Fool's jokes. In Hardy's eyes, it was full of wild imagination, but undeniably a considerable portion of it was actually correct. For example, the theorem at the bottom of the third page had already been established by J as early as 1859. Bauer, and also these so-called atoms, which belong to a class known as hypergeometric. Euler and Gauss had both published related research on functions of series. However, the results given by Ramanujan were even more advanced than Gauss's. So the question is, what are these? Where did they come from? Are they correct? What kind of person could discover so many theorems? Was the person who wrote the letter just a fraud trying to deceive the world, or a mathematical genius beyond anyone's reach? Hardy's mind was about to explode, and in the end he was so anxious that he just threw the letter into the trash can. Although out of sight for the moment, Hardy still couldn't forget the contents of the letter. You could say he even dreamed about this letter at night. It troubled him so much that he suffered from insomnia for several days, tossing and turning until dawn. In the end, the anxious Hardy had no choice but to fish it out of the trash can again. He took those letters to discuss with his good friend, who was also a mathematician, John Littlewood. The two old men huddled together, burning the midnight oil as they studied them. Ramanujan had included a long list in the letter of unproven theorems, and after 8 days, the two of them reached a unanimous conclusion. These results must be correct because no one could have made them up out of thin air. Littlewood was even so excited that he exclaimed, "We've discovered another Newton!" On February 8th, Hardy and Littlewood formally wrote a reply to Ramanujan. "Your letter and the theorems you stated are of great interest to me, but you must understand that I need to see proofs for some of these assertions first. In my view, your results can be roughly divided into 3 categories. First, quite a few of the results are already known, or they can be easily derived from known theorems. Second, some results, as far as I know, are entirely new and interesting, but their appeal lies more in their novelty and apparent difficulty than in their importance. Third, there are some results that seem to be both new and important." This reply made Ramanujan extremely excited. This was the first time he had received positive feedback from the international academic community. After that, Ramanujan and Hardy exchanged several more letters. Almost every time Hardy read a letter from Ramanujan, he became even more convinced that this genius should be introduced to the whole world. So in 1914, Hardy proposed to take Ramanujan to Trinity College, Cambridge. For Ramanujan, this was definitely a great opportunity to showcase his talents. But unexpectedly, he hesitated for a long time before agreeing, and the reason was quite simple. As a child who had been raised by a devoutly religious mother from a young age, Ramanujan was extremely devoted to religious doctrine and strictly adhered to vegetarianism. It would be hard for him to maintain this discipline in England. More importantly, Ramanujan's mother claimed that she had consulted a fortune teller who said that if her son became famous, his life would be cut short. But if he lived an ordinary, unremarkable life, he would be able to live in peace. For a mother, whether her son is successful or not is naturally less important than his life. So she always opposed Ramanujan going abroad. Of course, we have no way of verifying the truth of the fortune-telling or the dreams. Perhaps it was something his mother made up because she didn't want Ramanujan to leave home and go far away. Ramanujan's refusal also caused a rift between him and Hardy for a time, but in the end, an unexpected dream brought a turning point. According to legend, his mother had another dream in which the goddess Namagiri gave her an order. She was told not to hinder her son's pursuit of his life goals any longer. Finally, on March 17, 1914, Ramanujan boarded a ship to England. He set foot on foreign soil. Upon arriving in England, the biggest problem Ramanujan faced was with food. Due to the impact of World War I, the entire country of England was under wartime rationing, and food that met his religious requirements was very scarce, which made things difficult for him. He was often so hungry that he felt dizzy, and for someone whose health was already frail, this led to frequent minor illnesses. In terms of academics, Ramanujan's lack of formal education also became apparent. When people asked him how he arrived at his conclusions, he would insist that they were inspired by the divine. Even Hardy quietly complained about this. He said that the limitations of Ramanujan's knowledge were as astonishing as the depth of his knowledge. At first, Littlewood taught Ramanujan how to conduct rigorous mathematical reasoning. But every time Ramanujan learned something new, he would have an outburst of creativity. He would come up with a large number of novel ideas, truly able to infer 10 things from one, leaving Littlewood at a loss for how to respond. But even so, they still managed to organize and produce many research results together. The original method developed jointly by Ramanujan and Hardy. Today, the original method is one of the core tools in analytic number theory. There is also the taxicab number 1729, also known as the Hardy-Ramanujan number. The smallest number that can be expressed as a sum of 2 cubes in n different ways is now called a taxicab number. At the same time, Ramanujan was also the first person to discover K3 surfaces. Because Littlewood was summoned by the authorities shortly after the war, they planned to publish all these results after the war ended. In March 1916, under Hardy's guidance, Ramanujan received his degree from Cambridge University, and a year later he was elected a member of the London Mathematical Society. In 1918, he was also elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, in fact. He was the second Indian to be elected after Ardashir Kursachi in 1841. This was the highlight of Ramanujan's life, but it was only these few months that were his brightest moments. Because just a year earlier, Ramanujan had already fallen seriously ill. He spent a long time living in a sanatorium, as British doctors suspected everything from malignant rectification to other illnesses. From stomach ulcers to finally being diagnosed with tuberculosis, one diagnosis after another was given without clear notification. Almost everyone knew that this genius could die at any moment. By the end of 1917, unable to bear the torment of illness any longer, Ramanujan tried to jump onto the tracks at a London Underground station. He attempted suicide, but at that time in Britain, suicide was a crime, so the police arrested him. It was only through Hardy's intervention that he was released. Another year passed, and the frail Ramanujan, sensing that his end was near, resolutely returned home. He returned to his hometown of Kumbakonam, India, and passed away there in 1920 at the age of 32. After his death, his brother Tirunarayanan organized Ramanujan's work. The handwritten notes from his final year of research included formulas on Mach theta functions, hypergeometric series, and continued fractions. His widow Janaki Amal once recalled that even in his final days, Ramanujan continued his mathematical research despite being in extreme pain. He filled sheet after sheet of paper with numbers. During his short life, Ramanujan independently compiled nearly 3,900 identities and equations. Even in the final days of his life, he proposed the Ramanujan conjecture. This conjecture was eventually proven in 1973. Let us imagine for a moment, what if Ramanujan had been exposed to modern mathematical ideas and methods at the age of 16 instead of 26? What kind of astonishing history might he have created then? The year after Ramanujan's death, the journal Nature included him in its calendar of scientific pioneers. Every person featured on that calendar, every scientist featured on it, was extraordinarily accomplished. In 2011, on the 125th anniversary of his birth, the Indian government declared that every year on December 22nd would be celebrated as National Mathematics Day to honor this great mathematician. When we look back on Ramanujan's life, we can't help but we wonder what it was that supported this soul, struggling in poverty and illness, to trace such a brilliant path across the starry sky of mathematics. He was born into a world plagued by smallpox and grew up wandering, driven away by relatives. Even as an adult, he had to scramble just to earn enough for a meal. Yet even such a person, pressed into the mud by fate, always kept his head raised, gazing intently at the universe of mathematics. In his formulas there was no complaint, only an obsession with patterns and laws. In his notebooks there were no words of lament, only relentless questioning of the unknown. Now, those formulas that were once questioned and criticized for their flaws have become signposts that guide humanity across a century toward even more distant truths. 32 years of life was far too short for him to complete all his conjectures, but his 3,900 achievements are more than enough to show us what true genius is. Geniuses are not the darlings of fate, but those who are willing to give everything for the sake of truth.